Yeah, yo, excuse your pardon. Y'all gonna hear Kenzo in the background, man. Shouts out to my girl. She holding him down right now while I do this episode for y'all. So we about to get into, I don't even know what episode this is of Options Gang Radio. We're gonna take a step back a little bit, and we're gonna do an episode for this episode is kind of geared more towards beginners. So most of the people that are in Options Gang, this episode probably won't really be too relevant for you because we kind of gonna already discuss topics that you guys are already aware of. But we do have a couple of new members, and I've noticed a couple of new people have been asking me a lot of questions that are kind of been kind of recurring questions. So I figured, let me just do a beginners episode so like I could give people something to reference to whenever they want to get started up. And one thing I just want to put out there, bear with me, guys. I'm not a teacher by profession, so this is actually going to be my first venture into, I guess, education, however you want to call it. But let's just get into everything. So the first question, and I just want to precede this by saying that I'm speaking from a point of view where I'm assuming that you guys actually know what stocks are and basic info about, like, what buying and selling a stock is. If you don't really know what stocks are or what the concept of buying and or selling a stock is, the live is going to be up a day after, and it's going to be up on the podcast. So, you could tune in now, but it may be something you want to revisit after you kind of get those concepts down. But you got to kind of already, I'm speaking from a point where you already know what a stock is and what buying and selling a stock is. So just keep that in mind for anybody tuning in and listening now. So the first thing people want to know is, like, what is an options contract? So, like, an options contract in purest terms is an agreement to buy and sell. And in this case, we only use stocks, but options could apply to all types of commodities. But for all intents and purposes of what we're doing, it's an agreement to buy and sell an object between two parties, or stock between two parties. So when I buy, if I'm a buyer of an options contract and I buy an options contract from someone, what I bought was the right to buy or sell an item on for a predetermined price on a predetermined date. So I bought the right to do it. The seller, now, the money that I paid him for that contract, he's being compensated for giving the obligation to that contract. So if I choose to say I do actually want to buy those stocks, he's obligated to sell me those stocks. Or vice versa. If I do want to sell those stocks, he's obligated to buy those stocks from me. So the buyer pays for a contract for the right to that asset, but he's not obligated to exercise that contract. He just has the right to exercise it if he wants to. The seller, he's receiving money because he's giving someone the obligation. Now, the sellers of contracts, for all intents and purposes, when Options Gang does trading, we do everything on the buyer side of the contract, even though we buy and sell contracts. And I know the concept could kind of get confusing when you say buy and sell and you're referencing two different dynamics. But for all intents and purposes, for people in Options Gang, when we do plays, we're on the buyer side of this. When you're on the seller side of a contract, how you win on that contract is through time decay. So a seller of a contract wants a contract to expire worthless so he can keep the money that you paid him for the contract without ever having to fulfill his obligation that's underlying within the contract. So I know this kind of sounds confusing, and I'm trying to break it down as simple as possible, but I do know it's probably kind of confusing to people. So, like, the best way, like, I'm going to try to use an analogy to kind of simplify things. So say if you got a house, right? And your house is currently worth $100,000, and you say, like, yo, I want to sell this house. And then I come up to you and I say, yo, I'll give you 10 grand, right, for you not to sell this house for the year, but I have the right to sell that house for you at any point in the year for $100,000. Like I have the right to get that house from you, to buy it from you. I'm sorry, for $100,000 for the whole year. If at the end of the year, the house is worth if 6 months in, the house is worth $150,000. I have the contract. I have the contractual right to buy that house from you for $100,000. So if it's worth $150,000, I could buy it from you for $100,000 right there and sell it for $150,000, make $50,000 profit. So that's essentially how the dynamic of an option contract works. But on the flip side, if that house now is from being worth $100,000 at the end of the year is now worth $50,000, the right to buy the house at $100,000 isn't really worth anything. So that paper, that $10,000 that you paid, just kind of expires worthless because no one's gonna buy that necessarily from you. So the option contract itself, you're paying for that actual agreement. So now when people like what we do in Options Gang are doing options trading, like we're buying and selling those agreements. So we try to buy that agreement, ride that agreement, increase in value to a certain amount, and then we sell that same agreement back to the market. Like I said, we're always on the buyer side for the most part. We don't do the seller side. Like we're not generating the contracts and putting them out on the market and selling them and hoping they expire worthless. We're purchasing contracts in the open market, waiting for them to rise in value and getting them off. So now I just use that example with the house just to kind of simplify the terms. But now when we bring it back to the stocks, each option contract represents 100 shares of stocks. So if you say, I buy Apple stock or whatever. And again, I'm just going to throw random numbers because I just want to make the numbers, simple for everyone, to kind of understand or whatever. So if I want to buy Apple stock, right, and Apple stock is worth, $5 right now, and I want to take a position on Apple stock, if I wanted to buy 100 shares of Apple stock, right, it would cost me $500 to enter that position, with it being worth $5 a share. Now, what an option contract does is it allows you to take a position on those 100 shares of stock without actually owning 100 shares of stock. So now, instead of putting up the 500, and now again, these numbers that I'm putting out here are just made up numbers. I'm just trying to just give you the basic dynamic in terms of the value and the leverage. So now, if we're doing an option contract on that, the option contract will be a fraction of that cost. So an option contract on those same 100 shares that would have cost you $500 to actually get the actual shares may cost, $15, $20, $50. The price will always vary because there's a bunch of things that go into option pricing, which we'll go into later on. But the whole point that I want you to get at this right now is that you're basically paying a fraction of what you would have to pay to take that position in actual stocks. Now, with that being said, since each of these contracts represent 100 shares of stock, there's a concept called leverage. So now, if Apple goes up, 5% or whatever stock you had the option contract for, depending on the strike price and expiration date, which could all vary, that same movement could be anywhere from, a 20% to 150% gain in the option contract price, also always depending on all the variables. So this is not any set of fixed numbers. It'll always depend on the individual contract you have, and these prices are always changing because they always respond to the ever-changing dynamics of the market. So as the prices fluctuate and volatility fluctuates, as time lapses, because these option contracts, I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but all of these contracts are contingent on time. So, all of these contracts have an expiration date. And like I said, when you go back to the buyer and the seller of the original option contract, the sellers who generate the contract, they want the contract to expire worthless, so that premium that you paid them, they keep. The buyer who buys the contract is speculating on a price movement, whether it's up or down, whether they're choosing to buy or sell, and we'll get into the two types of options later on. But I just want you to get, for right now, just understand that options are leverage. They're an opportunity to increase potential returns, with minimal capital, but also at the same time, that volatility in terms of, so that same, 60% swing that the contract can have if Apple goes up 5%, if Apple goes down 5%, that same contract can have the 60% swing the other way. So this is why options for a long time wasn't even available to the retail public, because of this high volatility. And for the most part, the market assumed that the general public, the average investor, isn't educated enough to kind of play with that type of volatility. So the ease of access to even getting into options trading is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, this is like within the last decade. Even 20 years ago, it was not this easy to start an account and actually get started in trading options. And in general, one thing, let me just bring this back a notch before we go forward into explaining options. Options in general, kind of how they even developed in the market, were as a way to hedge positions. So it's like, all right, if you actually owned 100 shares of, 1,000 shares of Apple, and you wanted to hedge some of your position, you could buy you could buy put options against your actual stock. So again, you're only putting up a percentage of what the value would be to ensure that amount of actual stock. And if the stock goes up, so be it. The stock goes up, the money you paid for your option is lost. But that's like, it's the same concept as like car insurance. So even options as an industry really developed as insurance for like big market makers and big market movers. Due to like really heavy positions, were able to kind of insure their positions by buying options against whatever stocks that they actually held. So getting into option contract, let's kind of like, I just want to go take a step back and kind of like break down what an option contract is made of. So there's a couple of things that are in all option contracts. One, that's the strike price. So the strike price is going to be whatever price you agreed upon for that option contract. So if Apple is worth $5, and you say, I want to get call options, and for all intensive purposes, I'm just going to speak to call options, and I'll explain the difference between call and put options later on. But just for example purposes, we'll say call options. So if you say Apple's $5, right, and you could say, I want to be able to buy Apple at $6 in a year from now. You put up that premium, that fraction of whatever it costs to get your position on the option. If Apple goes up, so hold on, before I not even say what Apple goes up, that $6 is the strike price. So the price that you agreed for your option to be is the strike price. So if Apple's $5 right now, and you say, 6 months from now, a year from now, I want to be able to buy Apple for $6. The $6 is the strike price of your actual options contract. Each options contract also has a premium. So the premium is that money that was exchanged that I talked about earlier between the buyer and the seller, the original creator of the contract, the person that's selling the contract. Or even if you want to go back to the house example, this is the premium